Hello, everyone. I'm Nadav Shemel from Mining Journal's Digging for Climate Change. And with me today are Mining Shared Value Program Director Kyele and Managing Director Jeff Geipel. Mining Shared Value is a non-profit initiative of Engineers Without Borders Canada, and it seeks to increase mining local procurement around the world. MSV acts as a champion, hub, and resource on the topic, seeking to strengthen industry best practice and reporting, support policy development, and contribute to effective programs seeking to build local communities. We at Digging for Climate Change recently published an opinion piece by Kyele on the impact that Scope 3 emissions calculating and reporting will have on local economic opportunities in mining host countries, and that's a discussion we'll continue on today. So to kick off, just transition principles state that workers and economies mustn't be left behind, and that they must have meaningful opportunity in sustainable supply chains. So how does this apply to the mining sector right now?
Great. So maybe I'll kick us off here. Thanks so much for having us. And it was a pleasure writing the piece and discussing more on the topic today. Maybe I can just start by sharing the importance of local procurement. So us as Mining Shared Value are interested in what local economies, and particularly local suppliers to the mining sector of goods and services, need in order to be supported, in order to ensure that there is meaningful, sustainable local economic participation within mining host countries. And especially as we move into the green transition here, and supply chain priorities begin to shift to account for green transition principles. What does that look like for local economies? How can we ensure that local economies are brought along on that journey and that opportunities at the local level are still being created? So local procurement in particular, despite the focus historically more on taxes, for example, for host country benefit and revenue, local procurement is actually the largest spend at mine site level in most, if not all cases. So it's a really big leverage point for economic development. It's also very important for social license for companies and so on. So it deserves to have a big focus within this topic. It ties a lot as well to things like the resource curse, and ensuring that we're able to leverage the existence of mining, the presence of mining for these economies, and hopefully then diversify to beyond just mining. So there's an opportunity here for sustainable growth. And so when we look at what barriers traditionally are being faced by local suppliers, we look at things like unbundling contracts so that local suppliers are able to access these opportunities. We look at access to finance. And our focus now is how can we ensure that local economies, as new green priorities come into the supply chain. So for example, Scope 3 reporting that's being developed now, ICMM, the International Council for Mining and Metals, has made a commitment, for example, by 2023 to create their Scope 3 targets. How will this affect the ability of local suppliers to harness opportunities and grow opportunities within the mining sector? So the big risk here, I guess, is that green priorities that absolutely need to take shape in the mining sector and quickly, given the state of the climate crisis. How will these adjust, for example, procurement evaluation systems that may push out unintentionally the ability of local suppliers to meet these opportunities? So how can we bring them along in the process?
You mentioned there, and also in the article you spoke about this, these evolving green priorities and a potential conflict with economic development opportunities. So we headlined that in the piece you wrote, the conflict between the E and S in ESG. So could you describe this tension further?
Sure. I think what we've seen to date is that institutions, whether it be mining companies, governments, those supporting supplier development, bilaterals, the social and the economic impacts are often dealt with in silos, and they're not necessarily talking to each other. So there's a lack of kind of interdependency on these issues. There's a lack of acknowledgement of that. And there's a need for much closer collaboration, even within institutions, let alone between them, on the topics of environment and social issues and opportunities. And this is kind of highlighted, and there's a recent report by the World Bank as part of the Extractives-Led Local Economic Diversification Program and Community of Practice that we help host, on building resilience. It's called a green growth framework for mobilizing mining investment. And they display this really well, kind of these siloed approaches. So what ends up happening, of course, is that we're seeing little overlap and therefore a reduced ability to design interventions in a way that are supporting both of these priorities. And in fact, in some cases, maybe they're conflicting. So ideally, for example, the ICMM targets that are being developed, how can these be paired with their own economic participation work that the ICMM is doing? How can one serve the other as a function and therefore mitigate risk? What we don't want to see happen is that scope 3 is being implemented in such a way where a mining company is scoring their suppliers that end up favoring large international suppliers who have the capital to immediately, for example, start reporting their own emissions to the mining company. How can we ensure things like a transition period where small suppliers can gain the skills and capacity in order to report as well, so that they're not immediately pushed out? So by kind of beginning to acknowledge and create bridges between the E and the S, as we all work to further ESG priorities, I think we'll be able to really flourish in how we're meeting these opportunities and challenges. Jeff, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I think I might just add that, I think every piece of the puzzle is trying to get this right in terms of the green transition. But if regulators, for example, don't think about these consequences, we could really have trouble. And the example I would use is there are many countries and regions who are putting in regulations in terms of climate change, carbon emissions reporting, and these are all fantastic. We need companies to report their emissions. But if we do make companies report, for example, scope 3 emissions, that does mean that they have to be able to report the kind of emissions of suppliers. And the reality is that host country suppliers in many countries are not ready to report those figures. And so we need to make sure that if we are making regulations, which are what we need to incentivize action by companies, that these regulations take into account the needs of host countries. Because what we don't want to have happen is the EU rules or US rules basically incentivizing mining companies to start buying from international suppliers who are higher tech and greener at the expense of host country economies.
Looking at things from a practical perspective, what would best practice local supplier or having best practice local supplier support evolve to include green practices? What would that look like in practice?
So I guess traditionally from kind of SME support, we'll see things like unbundling contracts. We see things like access to finance. What we really need to do is update some of these best practices for local procurement to add this green lens, which we hope to see in the coming years. From a policy side of things, I guess this is kind of supply side policy focused, but governments more broadly are going to need to support their businesses to start to have some of these things up to par in terms of green behaviors, reporting, and so on. So this is going to have to happen across the board, but they need to invest in the ability for their own economies to meet these challenges. And how can we design this in a way that, as I mentioned, we have a transition period, for example, to catch up on some of these expectations. So the policy side needs to be brought in here. Company side need to adapt their best practices, business training, connections. We're starting to see actors who are explicitly focused on helping to prepare businesses to get ready for carbon reporting, for example. So how can we tie in some of this capacity work to what's going on?
Yeah, I might add also that essentially this is going to become the norm everywhere, right? So we're going to be needing to report emissions essentially of a certain threshold size business in advanced countries. I guess the lesson is that as hard as it's going to be, host countries and developing regions are going to need to start mandating that for their own suppliers as well, because it's going to come eventually in some form, and it's going to come in our case, in the case of suppliers being asked to provide this data to companies who buy from them. So it is in the interest of governments to recognize this and start, essentially instituting their own requirements. And they'll need to be supported, but there also need to be some phase-in periods. But the key message is this will be the norm, and so developing countries are going to need to change their business regulation practices to accommodate that.
You've touched on this, and it comes back to the the conflicts between the E and the S in terms of actually emissions reporting. How does all of this actually, or how would all of this actually tie into, I guess, scope 3 emissions? Okay, if we're talking about up and down the or upstream, really in the supply chain, how would it tie into calculation, scope 3 emissions calculation and reporting?
Mm-hmm. Right now, I think what we're seeing is a greater focus on downstream when it comes to scope 3, which is warranted absolutely because there are more emissions downstream than there are up. I think the crux of the issue that we're trying to highlight at MSV is while downstream has higher emissions, upstream has really big implications for host country economies and therefore can't be left out of this evolution of how we're defining scope 3, what ownership companies, for example, will take within the supply chain when reporting scope 3. Upstream needs to be considered because there's big opportunities and there's also really big risks. And this comes to social license as well. The lack of jobs, both direct and indirect within upstream, if this isn't addressed and mitigated, will cause investment risks ultimately as well from the industry side of things. So smaller emissions, but bigger risks. And when we're talking back, your first questions about just transition principles, we need to ensure that the green transition within the mining sector is not leaving workers and communities behind. So in that sense, upstream is really important. We're also seeing, of course, is host country governments are starting to look at, how they can get themselves involved from an economic perspective in the evolving mining sector. As we're looking for critical minerals, we're seeing that we all understand the role of mining moving forward in green transition energy sources and so on. So there's a lot of discussion going on right now about where to harness those opportunities. Is it building a smelter kind of downstream approach to new economic opportunities as we're building battery metals and so on, or is it upstream? So this is a big debate going on as well that I think ties into all of this. Yeah. Jeff?
Just to add that, when we're looking at the green minerals, quote unquote, your copper, your lithium, your nickel, those mines are all taking place right now, for the most part, in developing countries. And so if we set up the mining and global infrastructure in a way where those countries can't have local suppliers take part, either because of these emissions reporting requirements, new technologies and automation, essentially these countries are not going to want to host these mines. Why would a country want to host a copper mine if there were very few jobs that it created and very few supplying opportunities? So, access to green minerals means supporting host economies of those mining countries.
Yeah, and we're seeing those expectations strengthen, right? Procurement is certainly a higher priority than, say, a decade ago in terms of investment and likelihood of setting up a mine with enough community support needed to get yourself off the ground. So we're seeing procurement and local content regulations pop up around the world. So these expectations are strengthening, particularly as Jeff mentioned. IGF has done some great work on New Tech, New Deal, and how the deal for mining will change as technology and automation shift where job opportunities are available, which makes procurement all the more important of a topic to really get right.
And Jeff from Mining Shared Value, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.